Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Martha Bicket. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Surrey and I'll be leading today's CECAN webinar. For anyone who hasn't joined us before, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We're an ESRC research centre. We were set up in 2016 with the support of a group of research councils, government departments and agencies. Our aim is to test and promote innovative evaluation methods. So that's methods that take into account and are appropriate for the complexity of the world around us. Our work has had a particular focus on nexus issues. Those are the interlinked areas of food, energy, water and environment. But the methods and issues we've been exploring are relevant to a much wider range of policy areas and challenges also, like health and social welfare. If you want to find out more about what we've been up to, do check out our website, cecan.ac.uk. So today's webinar is all about the shiny brand new supplementary guide that CECAN has produced for the 2020 edition of the Magenta Book. The Magenta Book being, of course, the UK's central government guidance on how to evaluate policies, projects and programmes. For the first 20 minutes today, I'm going to present an overview of the supplementary guide and some of its highlights. I'm then going to invite two of my co-authors, Dione and Helen Wilkinson, to join me in conversation. And we'll then have time at the end for a Q&A session with questions from you in the audience. So please do submit your questions for any of us in the Q&A panel and feel free to submit those at any point today, all the way up to the very end of today's web. The session is being recorded and technology and internet connections permitting, fingers crossed, should be made available on the CECAN website afterwards. Okay, so I'll kick off by presenting an overview of our guide and some of its key highlights to you. Complex systems are all around us, and their characteristics make their behaviour hard to predict, and they make it challenging to do policy making and evaluation. So CECAN was invited by government to produce a supplementary guide on complexity for the 2020 edition of the Magenta Book. The resulting guide, which is called Handling Complexity in Policy Evaluation, tries to explain what complexity is, and it gives some guidance on how evaluators and policymakers can work with this complexity. It's published by HM Treasury, and it's available now along with the new Magenta Book on gov.uk. Now, the guide is based on about 3 years research and development of evaluation methods by CECAN, as well as input from others. So here's a quick look at how we developed the guide. First of all, there's a lot out there already on complex evaluation and its challenges, both from the academic and practitioner communities, and particularly in the fields of health and international development. And these here are just a few examples. So we started off reviewing this literature, looking particularly closely at what's been written at that intersection between complexity and evaluation, and how complexity has been approached across different fields, evaluation domains. In particular, we were looking to find things like examples of complexity in policy and evaluation. How do people define the properties of complex systems? What evaluation approaches and methods have been used to work with complexity and how suitable are they? That sort of thing. We also drew on the broader CECAN team and CECAN's own research, developing and applying complex evaluation methods. So we pulled in insights from CECAN's case studies with government departments and findings from our fellowships and events programs. And then it was over multiple author meetings and workshops that we reflected on and drew the findings from these activities together into the guide through various iterations, various drafts of the guide. And it really evolved over time as we brought this information together and chewed over the issues. So I think we've got various different versions of the guide. They all look very different, and it's interesting to look over them as you go back in time. So then finally, supporting all of that, we're very grateful for all the external input we received. We had an independent advisory group that we brought together to give us feedback on the guide right from the beginning. They were chosen for their expertise and also to represent the perspectives of a range of potential users of the guide. And we also got feedback from methods experts and from the Magenta Book 2020 drafting team themselves to sort of make sure that the guide was aligned with what's being said in the evaluation methods community and with the Magenta Book update itself. So, what's inside the guide? The guide itself is divided into 4 main chapters. That's what is complexity, the challenges it poses for evaluation, commissioning and managing evaluations when working with this complexity, and selecting evaluation methods and approaches that are appropriate. Really, I like to think of the guide as being split into 2 key parts. So the first part pulls together what is complexity and what it means for evaluation into a kind of, here's what you should know about complexity. And then the second part is all about how to work with complexity. It's what can you do? So that's how it's set out. Now let's take a bit of a closer look at the first part. So what is complexity and why does it matter? We say that a system or a process is complex if it's made up of many different components. So these might be people, organisms, resources. These components are highly interconnected and they interact with each other in non-linear ways. And then in complex adaptive systems, and these are the ones we're really interested in, the system components can also adapt or learn in response to change. And this differs from the word complex is used in everyday conversation, where it's often used to mean difficult or complicated instead. I expect you've heard this example on the distinction between simple, complicated, and complex before, but I find it forced, I'm going to say it again. A simple task is something like making a salad. You can follow a recipe and you can be pretty confident you have a good idea of how it's going to turn out. A complicated task is something like getting a rocket to the moon. There are a larger number of considerations and calculations involved, but with quite impressive precision, we can land a rocket on a particular site on the moon in a particular time window. A complex task then is something like raising a child. You may have some influence over their education, your personal interactions with them, some of their early experiences, but so many things are also beyond your control, like their other relationships, experiences, and how their personalities are shaped by them. You can't predict with confidence what adult a given baby is going to grow up into. So raising a child is complex. In this presentation today, I'm going to highlight 3 select parts of the guide in particular. These are my personal picks of some of the bits of the guide that I think might be most useful and interesting to readers. The first highlight is in chapter 1, in this first chapter about what is complexity. And it's a table of images and examples to illustrate the characteristics of complex systems. So to really go into this issue of what is complexity in more detail. In our author meetings, we found ourselves using drawings and diagrams as a kind of common language to help us talk to each other about the various characteristics. And we found these visuals really helpful. And so we wanted to incorporate something similar into the guide. So with the help of a design expert, which was CECAN fellow Joanna Bunnett, we came up with images to accompany these key characteristics of complexity that we've featured in the guide. So this is just a snapshot of the whole table. You can find the full table on page 12 of the supplementary guide. In the first column, you have these properties that complex systems might exhibit and their illustrations. In the next column, our best attempted and accessible definition. And then finally, for each characteristic, some real world examples of that characteristic. And those are examples from the natural and social worlds and also from policy. So like I said, you can find the whole table in the guide. The table can be used to help you identify whether and which complexity properties might be present in the system or policy domain that you're working with. You may also want to use it to help you talk to others about complexity in more concrete terms. So that's whether you're talking to policy leads, analysts, maybe evaluation contractors, stakeholders. These are all people that need to be brought into the discussion when you're managing complex systems. So just to flash this up in front of you for a second, this is the full list of properties that we describe in the guide that we chose to pull out and highlight and discuss in more detail, and some of the pictures. So what do these characteristics mean for anyone trying to work with complex systems, like anyone designing or implementing policy for such systems? Well, it means that complex systems can be difficult to manage. You can't predict how a system will behave. And you need to expect the unexpected to some extent because things might always be about to change. So when working with complex systems, a key point is that evaluation is really crucial because it helps us to understand and navigate this complexity. Okay, so we've got an idea of what complexity is and some more detailed images and examples to help us identify it, talk to others about it. And then we've said here that complex systems can be a challenge to manage, and when working with them, evaluation is particularly important. Great. But hold your horses, because complexity can throw a spanner in the work for anyone trying to do evaluation. It makes it a bit tricky. And these are some of the challenges that complexity can bring to evaluation. So complex systems can be particularly sensitive to context and how the boundary and scope of an evaluation are defined. Complexity can make it hard to determine causality and whether a policy led to a particular outcome by making it hard to standardize an intervention or to be able to isolate a control group. Then because complex systems are changing, the design of the evaluation may also need to be changed over the course of the evaluation. And you should also be prepared that the system may change after the evaluation has finished, and that's going to have implications for how results should be used. So evaluation itself needs to be designed and delivered in a way that is appropriate for complexity. So that's a quick intro to what's in the first part of the guide. Now let's take a look at the second part of the guide. How to do evaluation when you find yourself grappling with complexity. The third key chapter in the supplementary guide is all about commissioning and managing evaluations when working with complexity. The Magenta Book identifies a number of key stages in the commissioning and management of an evaluation. And when the context and the policy are complex, these stages are likely to be much less clear-cut. In fact, you really need to adopt a whole new complexity mindset when working with complex systems. So throughout both the intervention and the evaluation, you want to be continually checking, building your understanding of the system, and responding to new learning and developments throughout your planning and delivery. This is a visual from the DEFRA complexity evaluation framework, which tries to illustrate how the stages of an evaluation fit together using this new mindset. So in this framework, evaluation is this set of nested processes that all interact with each other. You've got the evaluation around the evaluation purpose, which of course it may change over time. This purpose informs an iterative process, this kind of yin-yang of understanding the system and intervention and adapting the evaluation design. And these two elements, this yin-yang, will continue to develop and be updated throughout the evaluation. And then all of these activities are conducted with the ongoing engagement with stakeholders, and understanding and learning are fed back and embedded, really embedded into the relevant processes, both inside and outside of the evaluation. So that's the embedding, the purple circle. And then trying to coordinate all of this, finally all of these interacting components are led and managed by one or more individuals. So that's the managing aspect. all of these different levels are interacting with each other. And this really sort of tries to start to get to grips with how you need to do your evaluation differently when you're working with complexity. Adopt this complexity mindset. Here's an overview of the whole chapter on commissioning and managing evaluations when working with complexity, and what's inside. To pull out just a few key points, when you find yourself working with complexity, evaluation can help because it helps to provide regular and rigorous feedback, and it gives opportunities for ongoing learning and reflection. Ideally, your evaluative activity needs to be integrated with policy design and implementation, and it merges into this continuous process of learning and policy evolution, because the management of complex systems needs to be continuously monitored and adapted. Including key stakeholders is particularly important to help sort of understand where this complexity is taking place, and how the system works. But also be aware that stakeholders are likely to have different views on complexity and appropriate evaluation strategies, and those expectations and assumptions need to be managed very carefully. And then finally, evaluations need to be managed with the flexibility to be able to respond to changes in the system, or as new understanding comes to light. My highlight from the guide is in this chapter on page 37. So there's this really handy list of questions that commissioners and managers can use to aid planning and managing each stage of the evaluation process. And these are just some of the examples of the types of questions and prompts that we encourage commissioners and managers to ask themselves. Now, if this is the type of thing that you're interested in, I do recommend also taking a look at DEFRA's Complexity Evaluation Framework, which was published by DEFRA in January this year. So moving on now to the final chapter. In this chapter, we look at evaluation approaches and methods that can help when working with complexity and how to choose between them. So there are lots of methods available to choose from. Unfortunately, there's no magic formula to tell you which one is best to use. It's a matter of horses for courses. You're likely to need to use a mix of methods, and beware that that mix may need to change over the course of the evaluation. And again, it's important to be aware of the need to be flexible and that you may need to change the design over time. So how might we go about selecting an appropriate design? Well, for this, we draw on this evaluation design triangle, which is adapted from Elliot Stern's Impact Evaluation Guide. And it shows that there are 3 key interrelated considerations when creating your design. So you have the evaluation purpose, why you're evaluating, the attributes of the system that you're working with, and then feasibility, which based on your resources like time, data, and skills. And this sets us up nicely for highlight number 3, which for me is the tables in this chapter. So this chapter contains 3 really fantastic tables, one for each corner of the design triangle. Starting with evaluation purpose, the first table matches evaluation questions, what you're trying to get at with your evaluation, on one side with the relevant methods and on the other. So here's a glimpse of what that table looks like. And you can find the full table on page 46 of the guide. Moving to system attributes, a second table matches up complexity challenges, so the different types of complexity that you might have in your system, the system attributes, with the methods and approaches that can help to address them. And finally, to help with feasibility considerations, a third table sets out the different methods and approaches and looks at what conditions can improve or worsen their feasibility. So for example, configurational approaches are more feasible if you have consistent information for some or more of your factors, and feasible if you have fewer than 5 or 10 cases available for analysis. So for each method and approach, it also gives an idea of what specialist skills and resources are required. And that, in 20 minutes, or maybe a bit more, is the supplementary guide in a nutshell. It's written for analysts, evaluation commissioners, practitioners, including contractors doing public sector evaluations. But it's also written for those involved in or in charge of designing and implementing policy. Because when you're working with complex systems, it's so important that these are really well integrated and run in parallel with one another. How to use it? It's designed to complement and be used alongside the Magenta Book. It provides further guidance on how to use evaluation as an effective management tool and how to use it appropriately, of course, when policies, programs, projects, or their evaluations are particularly intractable or complex. And then where to find it, it's on the gov.co.uk website, alongside the new Magenta Book and its other supplementaries. You can find it there and point your colleagues in the right direction. And then this is a nifty little flyer we've produced to promote the guide and explain what's inside. If you've got a colleague you want to tell about the supplementary guide, but they don't have 20 minutes to watch this, you can find it on the CECAN website. We might even be able to share a link to it after the webinar. So that's the end of the first part of the webinar. If you have questions, I see that people have already been starting to submit some of those. Please do submit them via the Q&A section, and we'll address them at 1:45. But first I'm going to invite two of my co-authors to join me. So developing the supplementary guide was a combined effort. Lots of people from CECAN and beyond have had a role in shaping it. I'm joined now by my co-authors, Dione Hills and Helen Wilkinson. But I want to also take a moment to acknowledge our other co-authors who aren't here today, and that's Alex Penn, Nigel Gilbert, and Ian Chris. So Dione Hills is a principal researcher at the Tower Institute of Human Relations, and Helen Wilkinson is Director of Risk Solutions, and they're both CECAN partners. And over the next 20 minutes, I thought it would be interesting to escape a bit from formal presentations and for us to have a conversation together about our reflections on developing the guide. So welcome to Dione and Helen. I've got a few prompts which I'll read out. And here's one to kick us off. And it's, let's start with Dione perhaps. What expectations did you have for the guide when we started working on it in 2016?
It's a long time ago. It's difficult to remember. But I mean, the main thing, I was absolutely delighted when we were asked to produce this supplement to the Magenta Book, because I know how influential the Magenta Book is in terms of guiding evaluation across government departments, because I've provided quite a lot of training. But so I was really pleased. I thought it would be a difficult task, because explaining complexity in the kind of language and using terminology that was easy and accessible for people, I realised would be quite challenging. And also doing it in a number of words. I think we were asked to do 20 pages originally. It turned out to be rather more than that. But I didn't expect it to take us 3 years. So it was a bit of a shock just how long it did take. But I did think it would be difficult.
How about you, Helen?
Yeah, almost exactly the same reflections on how long it took and how difficult we thought it would be. I think what surprised me was how enjoyable it was as well, though. As you say, we went through many iterations and the guide changed and evolved through that process, but it was one of collaborative work, genuine collaboration between very different disciplines, people with very different experiences. And that was a very enjoyable and fruitful experience, I think.
Yeah. It's nice to hear you, Dione, reflect on, I've forgotten that the original brief, of course, was a very short number. I even remember thinking that we were trying to aim for perhaps 10 pages at one point. I think we realised quite early on that we weren't going to be able to get to do much of any use with just that. So it's become quite a bit bigger, but I hope the focus is still, well, we've tried very hard to make the focus still on creating something that was useful. So the next question is, what are the biggest hurdles or challenges that you came across developing the guide?
So for me, I think making the guide really accessible and practical. And I think there's further we could go with that, and we're doing work that CECAN's doing, developing guides how to do aspects of what's in the supplementary guidance is going towards that. But we needed the core document to be written in accessible language, to be structured clearly and logically, and to take what is by definition a very complex challenge and try to make practical, grounded guidance, and hopefully illustrated with lots of examples. And that was one of the areas we struggled with most. And I'll hand over to Dione now, because Dione found a marvellous book on failures in evaluation, which helped provide quite a bit of sort of insight from people's experiences.
Yes. Yeah, one of the problems is that people don't necessarily talk about evaluations that go wrong. So finding examples of complex evaluations that perhaps had used the wrong method was not very easily available. But fortunately, this wonderful book called Evaluation Failures was published last year with 22 examples of evaluations that went wrong, most of which you could see were the complexity of the situation contributed. And in fact, I wrote a blog on the CECAN website, which I analysed some of the failures in terms of complexity. In terms of the hurdles, totally agree with Helen. I think bringing our different expertise together was delightful, enjoyable and challenging, and deeply grateful to Alex Penn, who brought her complexity experience, and when we tried to simplify things too far, she'd say, hey, wait a minute. So finding that balance between really getting the terminology right, but also accessible. I think structuring it, we had 2 or 3 different attempts at structuring it in a way that was easy and accessible. And I think the length was a constant challenge for us. We had to keep cutting back. But I think the other one, which we had a couple of away days that we worked on, was just really pulling out those core punchy messages so it didn't get lost in the detail.
Absolutely. I think you've both hit all of my sort of reflections on this question on the head. The challenge that turned out to be a real strength of the team of authors, with us all having slightly different backgrounds, very different backgrounds, and that actually helped us to kind of get out of our different topical seats and find a way of communicating in a common language. And that's, I sort of tried to point to that in the guide, where we ended up had to do away with words which had different connotations for different people, and we resorted to pictures, and that's why we've ended up having these pictures in the guide. But that was really something quite interesting. What have you learned from writing the guide? I'll start with you, Dione. What do you think that you've learned from writing it?
Oh, I learned a great deal about complexity. I'm essentially an evaluator. I have many years' experience of evaluation and of dealing with complex situations, but actually having a language and a set of terminology to unpick the complexity was great for me, and very, very enabling, very empowering. I think once you've got a set of tools to really look into the complexity and realize it's not just a mess, there's actually something useful going on. And I think, just that thing of working with colleagues from a very different background was really helpful. And also, I suppose, just the value of that interprofessional, interdisciplinary working, which I think anyone who's dealing with a complex policy issue does have to do. There are always various people who are going to have different perspectives on what's going on, and bringing that together in a constructive way is really helpful.
Yeah, I think the same for me, with working from different perspectives was very powerful. Also, the power of pictures, those little pictures, as Dione said, we were in a meeting room in the University of Surrey with no windows and hot housing over what did these complexity things mean, and suddenly Alex picked up a pen and started drawing pictures on a flip chart. I said, oh gosh, yes, we recognise that. We know real situations where that thing has caused an issue, has caused a problem. And that was what really kicked off the idea of trying to illustrate the complexity characteristics and give people a language so they could really recognise these things going on in the real world. And that's been tremendously useful. I've used that again and again and again. And working with people and talking to people who approach evaluations in such very different ways, and seeing the merit and the strengths and the weaknesses of those different ways of approaching things, that's been really eye-opening as well. Very good.
I guess I think the one I'd pull out is it's more a reflection just on policy making, evaluating on us as a society. I think we need to be much more open about our failures. I remember that we really struggled to find examples of evaluation failures in the literature, and we wanted to find those to help demonstrate the importance. We could talk about them anecdotally with lots of people, but to find ones that we could actually quote and reference. And it's such a shame, and it's true for both the academic and practitioner communities, but we've got so much to learn from these failures. And I appreciate, of course, the concerns that exist around damage to reputations, both individuals and organisations. But I think we need to get better at failing well, recognising it quickly, tweaking and improving and trying again. We don't get anywhere pretending something works when it doesn't. And at the other end of the extreme, if we're so afraid of failure that we bury the whole thing in the back of a cupboard somewhere, it's the same as throwing baby out with the bathwater. And we miss that valuable opportunity to learn and share lessons. So I think the challenge of trying to find those examples for the supplementary guide made me realise we just need to get a lot better. All right, let's have a look. So the next prompt I've got is, what's a key message that you'd like readers to take away from the supplementary guide?
I would say start evaluating as early as you can. In a complex, quickly developing environments, evaluation is your friend. It's the thing that allows you to understand or try and understand what's happening, and steer what your intervention to be more constructive, more positive. Involve as many people as you can in that. Keep an eye on why you're doing the evaluation, what you're going to do with the results, so you can make sure that the results you're getting and the way you interpret and communicate them is fit for purpose. And be flexible, be prepared to change all the way through. And we were told again and again that it's really difficult to procure flexible approaches to evaluation in government departments. That I would say, if you're commissioning evaluations, go and talk to the procurement people and see if you can get their help to procure on the skills and experience of the team, rather than on a set of fixed outputs, which you might find you don't need or you don't want very quickly into the evaluation. So that would be me.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I think I have a particular bent towards management of evaluations. So I think an awful lot of people start by thinking about the methods before they really think about the management and the how and the why and what's the purpose. So I think, and the how and the why and what's the purpose and what is it that you're really looking at, that early work, and also particularly bringing in a range of different stakeholders to inform that debate or discussion is absolutely central for me, as well as the idea of using agile or adaptive management techniques so that you've got a shortish cycle of feeding learning back in and responding to that and seeing what it means. There was something else, and yeah, I think that's it really. Martha, how about you?
They're just sort of, there are so many really. We've in the guide, one of the things we have done is that the first page of each chapter does sort of summarize the key points, and I was looking at which one would I pull out as the main one, and it is tricky, and that speaks to how hard we found it to sort of to synthesize all of this thinking down into something that's small and bite-sized. But I think it is really around this complexity mindset, and moving away from traditional notions of appraisal and evaluation happening afterwards, and moving more to just thinking a bit more about evaluative practice that happens before, during, and after, and alongside as you're doing this kind of adaptive management approach. I think there's something to be said that I'm not sure if we've touched on yet, but I think it's important to acknowledge that people listening today might sort of say, well, what's new? You know, all of the things that you've said are relevant to the success of any evaluation. And I think we absolutely agree. This isn't, there isn't a complete different way you should be doing things apart from perhaps adopting this complexity mindset. But when working with complexity, all of these different considerations, working with stakeholders, mapping of the system, putting time into all of those different aspects are just so much more critical to the validity and usefulness of any results. It's much more likely to go wrong if you don't do it when you're working with a complex system. And then I guess, so a sort of extra question that we had here that we wanted to mull over is, what kind of impact or changes do we hope to see as a result of the supplementary guide?
So, I mean, we've mentioned it several times that complexity is a mindset. It's not just a set of theories or a set of images or factors. It's a way of looking at the world, really, that really honours things like unpredictability and uncertainty and uses that constructively. And I think that's quite difficult in a world that's demanding clear answers. You know, does this program work? Why does it work? What worked particularly well? So I think gradually, hopefully, this sort of mindset will come into both commissioning and undertaking of evaluation, and will enable people to have sometimes quite difficult conversations. And I was thinking about this morning, and I thought, well, we are now living in a world in which there's a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of unpredictability, and the public has really been informed on the fact that science often doesn't have answers. So I think that it might well be that this is coming into a world that is more open to the complexity mindset than it was, 6 months ago. So anyway, that's the message for me that I hope people can take from this.
Now, I was quite struck when we were getting towards the end of the process, and we were talking to CECAN partners in Bayes and DEFRA, and we were introducing some of the concepts and ideas that were in the Magenta Book supplementary guide. There was a lot of enthusiasm from the analysts and the evaluators we were talking to, because they felt that having these things written down, having the guide available, would give them permission to go and talk to people who say, I want an answer, and say, well, it's not as easy as that. You're not going to get the answer. It isn't 42. It's, what we can do is help you explore the issues. We can work with you, feed information into your decision-making processes. And this idea that the guide gave people permission to have those conversations is really powerful. And I think Dione is right. I think the current situation is going to make those conversations easier to have as well. So hopefully it's going to be pushing against an open door.
I think what I'd really like to see is it's this idea that we talk a lot about or we've talked in conversations about the sort of adaptive management process and importance of being able to try things and change things on the trot, and the amount of resource that dealing with complexity can take. And I think it's what'll really show that we're starting to manage working with complexity is if we can see complexity appropriate planning and strategic thinking and evaluation taking place rapidly with limited resources. It's a little bit of a paradox, but it is this challenge of thinking, well, I've only got these things to work with. So what do I do? Shall I narrow down the questions, what I'm trying to answer about my system? Yeah, you've got to think very strategically about things, but that's the impact that I'd really like to see as a result of this guide. It's not just complexity means it takes more time and money. Of course, answering all of the questions that you have about a system, it will take more time, but how can we tailor and adapt and tweak our approach and be a bit lighter on our toes to work with these complex changing systems? So then last question's a nice short one, sort of what next?
Should I talk?
Go for it. Yes, please.
I mean, one of the things, my subject area really is how you build capacity for evaluation. And I think it's clear that a written guide doesn't change things.
No.
It can help, but you need multiple interventions very often to enable people. And we've seen people where we've run training, complexity evaluation training, forming some study groups together or support groups for each other. So I think the need to have more by way of training, support, coaching, advice, help for people, and bringing in experts who know about both complexity and evaluation to really support the work on the ground can help people to learn faster, and not just, hopefully the guide will be a good starting point, but it's probably not the end of the story.
Agree.
Yeah, so we do have some training and support options that we're developing. They'll be coming out to that work alongside this guide. And you also receive this link, so there should be a link shared up on your screens now where you can express an interest in hearing more about those training and support options. But we'll follow up with the follow-up email after this webinar. You'll hopefully get the recording as long as the IT's all worked well, a link to the presentation and a link to that email, to that interest form. So please do get in touch and wait to hear more about what we've got coming up in that area.
Can I just butt in there as well? Sorry, Martha, and say we really do need to want to hear from you, because we are in the process of developing these, and we want to know what would be most useful for you and your organisations, so that we're not developing them in a vacuum and saying, here you are, this might be useful. We really do want to hear from you. So even if you've just got a few thoughts, do fill in the form and send it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So the form has a point where you can sort of say what type of training or support you're interested in. But if you have more detailed comments, of course, please do feel free to email the CECAN inbox with those as well, if you've got more that you want to talk about. That's great. Helen, do you have anything you wanted to add on the what next?
No, that's entirely it. And I hope I hope that the launch of the supplementary guide will encourage other people to do their own thing, so that we get this many different interventions, many different messages coming from different directions, but all saying the same thing. Don't ignore complexity. Think about it. There are tools to help you deal with it, and use it as your friend.
All right. Well, that's a little conversation through just a few of us co-authors who were involved in developing the guide. We've now got approximately 15 minutes left, I think exactly 15 minutes left, for Q&A. I do see that we've got some questions collected already, but if you have any more, please do submit them via the Q&A section. I'm just having a quick filter through what we've got in. I'm going to pull one out here that's from Rick Davies. So it's, how much attention did you give to monitoring versus evaluation, given the need for more immediate information about events and response to them in a complex system, where future states of the system are not easy to predict?
I saw that question. I don't think we spent a lot of time talking about monitoring, which perhaps we could have done more, except as part of the evaluation process. And the fact that, I mean, most of the guide emphasizes the importance of having quick cycles of data collection and response and feeding that back in, which obviously is very compatible to the idea of having a good monitoring system in place. So I think there's probably more we could have said about that, but as I said, we had to keep things limited. But a very important question to ask. Maybe there's something more that we could write going forward on that.
Yeah, I think this probably, you're right, we weren't as explicit about monitoring in the guide as we could have been, but it does come back to this idea of evaluative practice, rather than talking about evaluation as being this thing that happens at the end, but this this idea of seeing how things are going and monitoring the intervention as you go along. So I think it's captured in that, and the adaptive management approach and the complexity mindset, but we've not used the word monitoring so much in the actual guide. I've got a question here. So it's great to hear the experience of working together to produce the guide was delightful. How did you create that atmosphere when some would say there is sometimes in the wider world of complexity and systems thinking quite a lot of sparring going on between different thought leaders?
Good. I don't know, I guess we just got on naturally. We were largely, the working group was all females. Don't know if that makes a difference. That's probably a very sexist thing to say. I don't know, we just worked well together, didn't we? We respected each other's disciplines. We weren't afraid to say when we thought somebody was saying was wrong. But we did it politely, I guess.
I think we had a very, very strong practical focus.
Yeah.
You know, we needed to produce something for practicing evaluators. It wasn't an academic document, and I think as you move away from the sort of academic debates and the divisions between systems thinking and different schools of complexity thinking, and really think about what is most useful for the person on the ground, then it kind of the more technical debates become irrelevant in a way. It's like, so what's going to be useful?
That's very true. And when we found clashes in the lecture and things like that, because of people coming from different sort of complexity backgrounds, as it were, our immediate response was never which one's the right one, but how do we communicate with all these different audiences using the different skill sets and disciplines and backgrounds that we had in the group, to think about how we could communicate clearly to anybody reading the guide. So we didn't sort of take positions and defend them. That was, it wasn't the point of the process.
And indeed, one of the messages is there are multiple viewpoints, and that's a feature of any complex system, that you have disagreements, and that's okay. You know, it's being big enough to embrace difference rather than looking for one answer.
Yeah, I think it helped. It wasn't planned this way. We didn't think that we would be working with the guide for so long before it came out, but we did have the luxury of having quite a bit of time to sort of process things together and knock things back and forth and go through these various iterations of the guide. I think it's important. Well, for me, I feel like that helped. We weren't. We were constrained by certain deadlines when we got drafts to various people, but there was a sense that we had the breathing space to really explore this issue. And I think that helped a lot as well. And it's probably something that to recognise, because not everyone will have that breathing space when they're working with these issues, and that can lead to these kind of sparrings. And ownership, of course, because we were working on it together. As you said, it was a collaborative process. I think a lot of sparring that goes on between different thought leaders in the world is about ownership of ideas and personal reputation.
One lesson I don't think we mentioned, and again was a huge luxury, was that every now and again CECAN would hold writing retreats where we went away and we stayed away from the office for a few days, 3 or 4 days, as a group, and could work on things individually and then come together, get other people from CECAN in to look and help and reflect. And that was, and then we, you'd go out for a meal in the evening or whatever, or we'd cook our own meal in the location. And that was a really constructive process.
Mm.
And having our colleagues in CECAN ask difficult questions of us.
Yes.
I've got a question here. So traditionally, programme evaluation is based on logic models, showing how the interventional policy is expected to induce change. How can a systems map substitute for a logic model? So i.e. non-linearity and complexity of interrelations can make this really difficult. Any useful tips?
Yes.
Go for it, Helen. You're the system modeler amongst us.
We have tackled that head on in a little subgroup. We're writing a paper for a special edition of the Evaluator, and there'll be other things I think come out via CECAN, which is exactly how do you take the system perspective into a theory of change map? Not necessarily a logic map, just a little looser than the logic map often is, but the same principle of following through from the policy intervention through the activities you do, the effect that's expected to have onto outcomes, but starting from a systems map, taking a systems perspective, a complexity perspective. And we think this is really powerful. It helps you build a theory of change map that will recognise and have built in all those feedbacks and non-linearities that are so much a feature of a complex system, and so often, not always, but so often missing from logic mapping or traditional theories of change. And this idea of starting with a system map, of having in your head and on a piece of paper all the things that you think are important to affect what you're doing and how that affects outcomes, and how those outcomes and impacts can then feed back and affect other things in the system. It really does help with this process of complexity thinking, evaluative thinking. And if you can start building that sort of map, that sort of picture, very early in the process of thinking about the challenges you face and how you're going to solve them, you've got a resource that can help you devise a monitoring system, can help you review the data you're getting and see whether you think, something else is happening here, go back to my map, see what it might be. It's a really powerful tool. So I think the answer to the tips and hints is to look out for the special edition of the Evaluator and subsequent CECAN publications on the process we would recommend that we think is particularly powerful.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Not much to add. It's Evaluation Journal.
Oh, sorry.
The Evaluator is a newsletter.
Really different.
There has a UKES Evaluation Society newsletter, and they have done one on complexity, which is probably still on the website.
Yes, I did not.
There was something else. Oh yes, I just wanted to say that the CECAN website has got a guide to participative systems mapping. I saw several of the questions really were how to introduce systems mapping into evaluation, and I think that guide is really helpful, and it's very compatible to the sort of collective work, participative theory of change or logic mapping that we often do in evaluation anyway. So I think building that in as well.
It's really a very practical guide. It's a very good guide, and what we've been doing for evaluation is building another layer on that, which is about turning a systems map, which can be quite a complicated picture, difficult for a jobbing evaluator to interpret, into something that's more familiar to the evaluation and policy design type processes.
All right, I've got a question here that I'm itching to read. It's quite understandably from an anonymous attendee. It says, I certainly haven't seen an example of a flexible evaluation contract in my department. Do you have any examples of where this was implemented and how this was achieved?
I don't know, so I've seen one. I've been part of ones that have been managed flexibly, having put the bid out and won it. I think the most flexible approach that I was ever involved in was a large appraisal process, so building an agent-based model to look at water abstraction reform, where that was a long process of talking to potential suppliers, bringing them together in consortia, juggling the consortium after bids have been submitted, asking for a particular set of outcomes, really, you know, information to inform the design of the reforms, information to inform the impact assessment, but not necessarily, and broadly the approach, an agent-based model linked to a hydrological model was indicated, and lots of stakeholder engagement. But there wasn't a sort of, you will do this many of this type of activity, you will produce this type of deliverable at this point in time, and that was DEFRA. But it was a while ago, a few years now.
Yeah, I think one of the recommendations we make in the guide is that experts on complexity are brought in to help with the commissioning process, and that can, and I have certainly responded to ITT's invitations to tender that in which an experienced evaluator with experience of complexity has contributed to that. And I think the main thing that's often done then is to build in a sufficient initial scoping phase so that that complexity can be explored in the scoping phase, and then at the end of the scoping phase there's a scoping report which then perhaps goes back to the original proposal and then says, well, we found this and this is going to change. So I have been part of evaluations that have been quite flexible, and I think it's often where the commissioners really do appreciate that the programme, particularly when the programme itself has been quite innovative, that they didn't know at the start exactly how it was going to evolve. And so, yes, of course, you have to rethink the methods and even the evaluation questions as you go along. So I think it's really down to the commissioners' appreciation of complexity and the fact that there will be uncertainty in their programme as they go forward. So I have had good experiences of that. I think I had a Department of Transport one, Department of Health, yeah, 2 or 3 that have been great. And it, as I say, it really does rest on the commissioners.
That's true. We've had a DFT one that's been brilliant and specifically designed with a lot of flexibility to redirect resource into special topics, but with a core of monitoring and annual assessment of the monitoring data, and then sitting at the middle, but then a lot of flexibility to do other things around that.
We did some work a little while back. I think one of our CECAN fellows took a look at the commissioning process, didn't they, and how to commission for complexity. And I think it's something that is needed is a bit more sharing of what these complexity appropriate contracts actually look like, because quite often you might be copy pasting something from a previous call that you put together, but to have one that has those bits of flexibility built in, it would be useful, wouldn't it? I got a question here. Speaking of CECAN fellows, recognise the name Sarah Georgie, who was one of our CECAN fellows quite a while ago. And she asks, have you begun seeing the impact of the guide? Has it been picked up in evaluation tenders, or is it used in policy parlance, for example? I'd probably just say to that, it's, first of all, guide came out end of March or 1st of April, I think. So it's very early days at the moment, but I think something that we have certainly seen over the course of CECAN is complexity and some of the language about complexity being used much more readily, and people starting to get a bit more fluent in complexity concepts, and using this terminology. Especially I've done some work with DEFRA, and I've certainly noticed that's the case in that department. So there's that. I think there's a second question about to what extent people are yet walking the talk and doing a lot of the things that we see in here. Can I pass that question about whether you've started seeing the impact of the guide over to you, Dione?
I think to see the impact of the guide itself is too early, certainly, but the work we did with DEFRA on developing their complexity evaluation framework, we drew on the guide very extensively for that work. And I think the feedback from the use of their framework, which is using a lot of the concepts that are also in the guide, is showing that it is having an impact within that department. So I think we're seeing it come in, but that is a very good evaluation question, Sarah. I think let's look back in. Perhaps someone will pay us to do an evaluation of the impact of the guide. Wouldn't that be good?
That would be nice.
Helen, anything from you?
No, I mean we've seen very little in the way of evaluations that we felt moved to go for. So we haven't sort of pored over ITTs to see if the supplementary guide is mentioned. It would be really nice if it was mentioned specifically, not just as the Magenta Book, because as soon as you say the Magenta Book, then the supplementary guides do come into play. And a lot of evaluations ask you to be Magenta Book compliant. Yeah, we haven't seen, but not necessarily been looking yet for references. I'd just echo what Martha said, the feedback on the complexity evaluation framework in DEFRA. DEFRA did a sort of a very early evaluation of that, just to help tweak it on the basis of the early experiences of people starting to adopt it. And that was very positive. People really liked having some way of framing their thinking, of talking to colleagues. And so hopefully, if the Magenta Book supplementary guide can get used, we'll hope that it will have the same impact.
All right, well, I think there's so much more, so many more questions that we've not been able to get around to addressing. I do apologise to everyone whose questions we've not answered, but they're fantastic, and I wonder if we can share them at some point somehow anyways. That is all we've got time for today's webinar. I do want to say thank you to Helen and Dione for joining me to tell you about the guide, and to everyone for coming and listening to us. I think we've had around 200 people joining us live today. We'll put the webinar recording and slides up on our websites at cecan.ac.uk, and I believe you'll also be receiving a follow-up email after this webinar with them in. If you want to learn more about what we do or get in touch with us, questions, collaborations, you can also find our details there on the website. So that marks the end of our webinar today. Really big thanks for tuning in. Do take care, particularly important in the current climate. And thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye from us.
Bye-bye. Yes.